So I'm going to begin this afternoon by introducing you to two exceptional people to my right. First, I'd like to introduce you to Sheryl Petty. Sheryl Petty has worked in educational systems change and organizational development for 20 years. Her work focuses on movement building and supporting the development of networks and strategic alliances among researchers, capacity builders, school systems, policy advocates, community organizers, funders, messaging and communication specialists, educator preparation institutions, and contemplative practice institutions. Yes, we are very fortunate. She is a national educational equity and systems change consultant, an associate consultant with Movement Strategy Center in Oakland, California, and Management Assistance Group in Washington, D.C., as well as a principal associate at the Annenberg Institute for the School of Reform at Brown University. She has been a high school teacher and executive director, a fellow at Stanford University's Center for Opportunity Policy and Education, a qualitative researcher, a life coach, and consultant to school districts, nonprofits, foundations, and universities. Her work and practice focuses on supporting individuals and communities to unleash our most vibrant selves and improve our collective lives. Welcome, Sheryl. Arthur Zajonc is president of the Mind and Life Institute and emeritus professor of physics at Amherst College. He was a visiting professor and research scientist at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, the Max Planck Institute for Quantum Optics, and the Universities of Rochester and Hanover. He has been Fulbright professor at the University of Innsbruck, Austria. His research has included studies in electron atom physics, parity violation in atoms, quantum optics. We have lightweight people this afternoon. Experiential foundations of quantum physics and the relationship between science, the humanities, and the contemplative traditions. He is author of the book Catching the Light, co-author of The Quantum Challenge, and co-editor of Goethe's Way of Science. In 1997, he served as the scientific coordinator for the Mind and Life dialogue published as The New Physics in Cosmology, Dialogues with the Dalai Lama. He is former executive director of the Center for Contemplative Mind, which supports appropriate inclusion of contemplative practices in higher education. Out of his work and his longstanding meditative practice, Arthur has authored Meditation as Contemplative Inquiry, When Knowing Becomes Love. He has co-authored a book with Parker Palmer, The Heart of Higher Education, A Call to Renewal. Please welcome Arthur Zajonc.
Are we live? We are. So welcome to you all after a full day of workshops and engagement. Well, I think one of the most important items on my CV that was left out is that I went to PS 36 in Staten Island. All right. In a situation like this, where we are working with educators and education, children, and so forth, in some ways looking back to that early situation, shall we call it, of a nerd, basically, if you will, in a public school in New York City, was a bit of an adventure, I must say. It was an exercise in bringing the two strands of our lives together: the stickball in the courts outside the PS 36 and on the playground, together with the fantasy of becoming one day a scientist, which somehow happened. I'd like to pick up one of the themes that we started with this morning, and also with the lovely dialogue or question and answer that we had also between Grace and John. That was such an apt beginning. Really was this theme of the twin strands of our lives, the strand of the active life and the strand of the contemplative life, the strand of the social activist in us that really does care about the world, and the strand which cares but has a caring that starts from, you might say, an inner place. And I'd like to explore with you a little bit more about those two strands and what they signify for our future. And so you might begin by just taking a few minutes to think of yourself in this regard. Maybe there's a particular emphasis, in some ways. Sheryl's here representing the active life, and I'm here representing the kind of nerd interior life. But I think it's not really true, right? We could swap chairs, and you could be over here with as much ease, and believe it or not, I might even feel relatively comfortable in your chair. But nonetheless, you might find that there's a center of gravity in your life, but explore both sides. Imagine yourself on the one hand as the monk, but also perhaps as the warrior, maybe the priest or the prince. And as you dig down and find those, what does it feel like to be each one of these? How is it you live within your identity as the righteously indignant, angry activist on the one side, as John called it, and on the other side as that deep contemplative, striving to become one, become whole. So on the one hand, these lives seem to be so divergent, so different. One turned inward, the other outward. One a life of meditation and reflection, another maybe a life of commerce or even bloody action out there on the battlefield. But as we talked about it, the geometry of life, it seems to me to be different now, to have changed. In 1964, a remarkable book appeared by Dag Hammarskjöld. He just died in a plane explosion. Some think assassination, others just think accident, but whatever, he passed, and we have this book, Markings of his, and in there one finds the following. In our era, the road to holiness necessarily passes through the world of action. In our era, the road to holiness necessarily passes through the world of action. A few hundred years earlier, in the 15th century, there's a fabulous book by Thomas à Kempis. And on the very first page of that book, in chapter 1, there's a different view. It's a fabulous book, so I don't want to say anything bad about it, but it's of a different era. It's not of this era. He wrote, "This is the greatest wisdom, to seek the kingdom of heaven through contempt of the world." To seek the kingdom of heaven through contempt of the world. Now, if you read further, you can understand what he really is trying to unpack there, but there's a turning away. Whereas I sense in Dag Hammarskjöld there's a turning towards the world. Towards the world. So this contrast that we have between the Middle Ages, if you will, and the time that we live in now is, I think, a strong one. That we are actually, I think of it as we're put into this world not because of punishment, or it's the prison house of the soul, as Plato might have called it, but because of love, I would say. We are here because we care. We're still students. We're learning to care for each other and for the planet, but I believe that there's a call, and it's the call of care. Care for each other, care for the world around us, and that's the call into the world. And that call into the world is a call also to be wise in regards to our actions. And so the reflection that is necessary for that is something to which we are also called, not only to action, but to wise and skillful action. Otherwise, we may unintentionally do harm. There's also this word necessarily that comes in the quote, necessarily passes through the world of action. In other words, it's kind of what we're in for. We are ethically committed to this good life and to make this good life better. And so it seems to me that we are necessarily engaged, passing through, not just as bystanders, but as engaged, active participants in this world. Every one of us inextricably bound to that world, to this, our world. You know, I love these old guys and gals that, one of them is Nicholas of Cusa, and he has the image of what he calls the coincidence of opposites. The coincidence of opposites. And so it may seem on the one side that there's an inner world and an outer world, but isn't it also possible just to imagine for a moment that somehow these are aligned, these are in coincidence with others, with each other? And that what we're called to live is the paradox of that coincidence of opposites. And if we lose one and we find ourselves isolated in the other, if we lose the world and find ourselves isolated in reflection, we've been lost. We can also lose ourselves in the world as well as losing ourselves from the world. You know, we each had these long bios read. It's a little too long maybe. But we had these long bios read, and somehow the complexity of this narrative is missing sometimes in these bios. You know, you write the bio for a particular purpose. You know, is this for the Amherst College, magazine? Or is this for my friends at Mind and Life? And you leave certain things out and put the other things in so that you look, copacetic from one standpoint or the other. But we should have, the bio which Cusa would have liked, which would have been like the whole person and all their rich complexity and all their impossible coincidence of opposites as the real narrative. Because what does it mean to be a research physicist who, from the time I was 20, studying physics, have been a meditator? How can I be a social entrepreneur at the same time as I'm a teacher? How can I be relentlessly active and at the same time a kind of easygoing, quiet kind of guy? Aren't we all in some measure complex in that way? And the simplicity that we seek is the simplicity on the far side of complexity, as Holmes talks about it, right? That it's not what's nearby in this complexity, but on the far side of that we have simplicity. So if we're called into this world by care, and I want to return to that a little bit later, I wanted to first, though, reflect on one of the things that you might say is the consequence of the call, namely we're called to attend. We're called to attend in a particular way. And here I love the essay by Simone Weil, the French educator and philosopher. And she has a strangely titled essay on education called Reflections on the Right Use of School Studies with a View to the Love of God. It's not a book, it's a little essay on, you could say, attention. And that the primary reality, you might say, the primary object of the school studies is really the cultivation of attention. But she characterizes two types of attention, one which is of furrowed brow and stern face and countenance and clenched hand, which might be good enough to get good grades, but she says it's really not the kind of attention that she's speaking of. Here are her words about this kind of attention, the second kind. Attention, she writes, is an effort, the greatest of all efforts possible, but it is a negative effort. Attention consists in suspending our thought, leaving it detached, empty, and ready to be penetrated by the object. We do not obtain the most precious gifts by going in search of them, but by waiting for them. The human being cannot discover them by his or her powers, and if he or she sets out to seek for them, they will find in their place counterfeits of which they will be unable to discern the falsity. What does it mean to, in this sense, to renounce, to not seek actively, but to renounce? To hold the question, to hold the concern, the suffering, whatever it might be, actively, wakefully, with full attention, but an attention which is not positive, but as she describes it, negative. I think very often when we say practice not knowing, it's not practicing a not knowing at all, but it's a practicing of a kind of not knowing in this first sense of attention, of the concentrated furrowed brow and clenched fist that's going to wring out of nature by force the truths that we seek. But there's another kind of empiricism, which Goethe calls a zarte Empirie, a delicate empiricism. And through that delicate empiricism, we will learn to wait, to be open. And this is the strange way in which attention becomes a way of attending that verges on care and ultimately love. When I subtitled this little book on meditation, When Knowing Becomes Love, it's maybe sounds like a cute title, but it's actually meant to be something which is a path through this quality of attention that Simone Weil describes, which has gentleness, delicacy, intimacy woven through it, such that ultimately we know by becoming the thing we would know. We know by identification, not by control or manipulation, not by force, but by learning to wait, such that as we do, the most precious gifts come and are obtained not by going in search of them, but by waiting for them. And I'll just end with the question, if we were to imagine what she calls it, reflections on the right use of school studies, with a view to love, we'll leave out the last phrase. What would that curriculum look like? What are those incipient capacities that each human being has early on in childhood all the way through to adulthood that can be nurtured, that become ultimately the ethical foundations of all of our lives? Those capacities for care, compassion, altruistic behavior, of true attention, of attending with a kind of non-possessing, non-arrogating form of awareness that welcomes all things. So I end with that as a question. What would that form of education look like? And I think in some ways it's probably the form of education that's been living in all of your hearts and to which you've applied yourselves in life. An education of caring for ourselves, but especially also for those around us and for this good planet. So maybe just a way of framing again what it is we've taken up as our theme, these two movements and their tales entwined. To you.
So I will pick up on some of those things. Am I going to be great? I got an opportunity to sit in on not quite all of the sessions this morning and this afternoon, and it was really fascinating and rich in a lot of ways, and all of the groups were different. I mean, what was happening in each room was actually in some ways very similar and in some ways very different. The community, sort of out of school time, youth focus group, folks were sitting on the floor in little circles around, and I'll share a little bit about that. Some folks had large, some folks had small, some were in more traditional settings, some had PowerPoint, some didn't have that at all. And the feeling in each room was that people were profoundly engaged, really, really present and riveted. And I also got a chance to touch bases with the co-presenters on lunch, and it was interesting that almost to a person, everyone actually seemed happy. I mean, not just, oh, things are good, but this kind of energy that I found really palpable. And it's an interesting thing. I mean, you all have had this experience today, and it was a short day. I mean, those sessions were actually quite quick, just the hour in the morning and the hour in the afternoon to really just get a taste and a flavor for this conversation. So I found myself reflecting on what will be needed to actually take advantage of this opening You know, these, for some, these are new conversations. For some, these are actually not new conversations. This is what folks are doing sort of every day in one way or another, you know, doing this dance in this dialectic. And I had a number of thoughts to share with regard to that. Some of them pick up on Arthur's comments, and some of them also go back to this morning's conversation with Grace and John. Around radical presence is the way that I might describe what we are attempting. This, you know, how do we have practice, whether you use the term contemplative or some other way to describe these skills and competencies around presence and awareness, and not get lost in the clouds? How do we be really, really profoundly engaged and both transcendent as well as immanent in the world, and what is the sort of radical bravery that it takes to do that? And now I was saying to folks in preparation for this conversation that contemplatives, or folks with any kind of tradition-based or non-tradition-based practice, are profoundly prepared, hypothetically, for engaging and really dealing with these frustrating, confusing, painful, you know, conflicting emotions. You've got things coming up and we're not even sure what we're experiencing or feeling, and yet you've got a practice or a set of tools that we can sort of fall back into. And yet that's one domain of tools. And it is, I would say, necessary but not sufficient. The other sets of tools, as we've gotten a taste for today, that are needed are some hard knowledge, historical knowledge around difference, around the impact of difference, around things like structural inequity and how that actually has shown up in education systems over time. That's a domain of knowledge. Someone was saying, I think I'm paraphrasing someone like Ken Wilber, and I think he was being interviewed. And someone said, you know, what's the difference between, you know, you and the Buddha? And he said, you know, I know how to drive a car. But what that means is we can have wonderful, you know, sort of relaxation, openness, you know, all of these great tools, and yet if we don't accompany that with a set of skills about what am I actually experiencing when I'm facing this child or this colleague or this situation where I actually don't know what's happening, and I'm not familiar with how I'm being communicated with, and I'm feeling all kinds of strange feelings. Maybe I'm pissed off. Maybe my palms are sweating. Maybe my stomach is churning. Maybe I actually just want to get out of here because it's just so extremely uncomfortable. Presence will get you to stay. It won't actually necessarily help you to fully understand the sort of depth that John was talking to us about, what someone else may be trying to convey or share, or taking that even further, the structures and systems within which we are working and teaching and learning. So I'm talking about that there are domains of competence and domains of knowledge, and these are muscles to build. These are like muscle groups for us to build over time. And if we are brave and courageous and continue to use our tools, it is inevitable that we will succeed at this work. It is a certainty. You know, what do they say? I used to have a teacher, my Buddhist teacher in California. She said, you know, enlightenment is inevitable. You know, what do they say in Buddhism? They say it's the natural state. It's not something you go get. It's something that you actually relax into. So, you know, what we're being called to and asked about today is, you know, how do we become agents of change? And someone in one of the sessions, I'm quoting a person who I don't know, said, you know, how do we become this intersection? You know, how do we embody? You know, we talk about embodiment. How do we embody that? I also wanted to share a couple more thoughts, assuming I have the time to do it, that I had a fascinating conversation a couple of weeks ago with one of our workshop co-presenters, Kristen Zimmerman, who's in the room, and we started talking a great deal about earth-based traditions and body-based traditions. So earth-based, you know, we had Patricia St. Ange this morning from an indigenous Native American community, body-based traditions. Many of you are familiar with yoga, Tai Chi, Qigong. There are energy-based traditions, and then there are mind-based traditions. And sometimes those things interact and overlap, and sometimes they actually do not. And there is a sort of neck up. In the best of all worlds, we would be attending to what's happening in our physical selves, what's happening in our minds, what's happening in our emotions, but it may not be that that's always how our practice is being exercised. And as we were reflecting on this session, you know, in the comments this morning from John, many communities of color, indigenous communities, we don't necessarily use the word contemplation or even practice. We may, you know, I do happen to be Buddhist, and I also practice an indigenous African tradition, and the semantics, the vocabulary, the language in those systems is actually quite different. One is very, very earth-based, body-based, energy-based, and one is very, very mind, not intellect, you know, but what happens beyond this within and beyond this sort of physical experience that we're having, so that we can show up in a more imminent and radically present way. So that was a really powerful and illuminating conversation for me to begin to think about, you know, what is this wisdom in action? What is, some systems talk about wisdom and skillful means. And I actually think that is the conversation that we're engaged in. What does it actually look like when we try it on? The last two things I would leave you with, something from the session. I'm calling the community group because I don't remember the title of it. It was the one that was originally focused around community and out of school time. And they had these papers, 5 sheets of paper, flip chart paper around the walls where the small groups were talking, and they had these sort of from-to statements, and these are the 5 statements. From competition to synergy, from control to creativity, from isolation to interdependence, from marginalization to leadership for the whole, and from defensive to proactive stance. And I thought that those were really, really poignant because a lot of their description of their session was around what is this embodied? What does embodied wisdom look like when you're active? I'm reminded of a conversation I had with my mother many years ago. I might have been a teenager or a young adult, and I was talking to her about all this social justice activism things I was learning about, and we're in a grocery store, and she says to me, "Well, Sheryl, not everyone's activism is going to show up that way. Everyone's activism doesn't have to look like that." And so, you know, I would offer to you that there are ways to be profoundly and radically engaged, and it doesn't have to look like any particular thing for us to really, you know, stand in our seats, sit in our seats, stand on our feet, and show up fully for what may occur, uncertainty, unknown, and the profound joy and beauty of that. I have a request to make, and Grace is telling me stop. I have a request to make that won't require us to do anything after this because Arthur and I are going to engage in a dialogue. I think it's important for us to somehow find out what does this emerging movement need in order to move forward? What do you all need? What are your ideas going forward? And so if you are so inclined, and you have these in your bag, you know, these cards, if you are so inclined to sort of jot down those thoughts, I'm not signing up Mind and Life to do anything, because this is going to be collectively, what are these ideas? There is a planning committee that was created to help create this event, and you all have heard several times about this Garrison sort of follow-up event in December. But these ideas are generative, and if you're so inclined and you know, before you leave, sort of leave those here, I'd be happy to gather those and be in dialogue with the planning committee about what do we make of this? And how do we kind of share this with this broader field of where could we go from here? Where do we go from here? So these are some thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. One of the things which was brought up this morning, and I'm wondering if we could pick this up in the light of, as we're stepping into the next, where do we go from here? The question that you kind of ended with. And it really broached this question of fear. And I think this is something which has been part of the barrier, the gap that we've been struggling to cross between activism on the one side and the reflection on the other side. And how is it that, especially I think, when there is difference, how do we meet each other in a way that doesn't fall into fear or fall into stereotypes? How is it we take sufficient interest in each other, whatever is that's required to overarch that gap? If we're going to take steps forward into the future together, we need to find some way of doing so, not with sort of equal time, separate but equal, but but something where the integration is genuine. Don't know if you have any thoughts about the fact of fear and how we meet it. How do we work past stereotype?
Yeah, I'm still reflecting on this body-based practice, embodiment, and attuning to or tending to what is actually going on physically for us. So we pay attention to body, mind, and emotions for presence. And another teacher of mine would often say, notice even the moments when inside of you, you're turning away even a little bit. You just pulled in, just pulled away a little bit. You're going into some kind of internal protection mode. It's subtle, and no one may know that you're doing that, but you know inside when the mind has started to go, I'm going to put that one over here. And if we notice those moments when we're doing this and can just soften and notice when we've sort of checked out slightly, and because then that can help us to figure out when am I being triggered? We get into our sort of habitual responsivity such that we don't notice that we're doing that because we're accustomed to, oh, that person comes up to me. It may be someone you see all the time, or a family member, someone who lives with you, or someone you work with, or a stranger. And there's this often unconscious recoiling that can be profoundly subtle, but shapes everything. That story that John shared with us this morning after the terrible incident that he had where he was attacked, that there was an imprint that was left that then he came to notice was actually happening and was shaping his responsiveness and reactivity. I think if we choose to and commit to attuning to that subtle recoiling, because it's not though when you slam the door and walk out. I'm talking the more and more and more subtle time when I'm like, I'm actually starting to check out. I'm starting to tune you out. You're going wah, wah, wah. It sounds like blah, blah, blah to me right now because I can't. Something is happening. So that I think that can help us. And then if there are emotions attached to those body reactions like fear or sadness or grief, anxiety, if those things are coming up, then we can be present to that. And what we say in all of these practices is if you allow things to both arise and dissolve, that is what they do. It won't actually just stay. They will. Things move. Things move unless we do this. Things actually move unless we.
Yeah. Thank you. It's I sometimes feel maybe there's a picture, that you're walking through, down a city street, and you're wondering, is this paradise? What keeps it from being paradise? It's in some ways I sometimes feel like the fear is an overlay, and the overlay arises because we let the mundane, if you will, or the fear dominate you. That you walk down that city street, and are you looking behind your back? Or are you available to what's about to transpire as a miracle? There was a period when I was young, I thought, I'm just going to do this as an exercise. I'm going to get on the airplane or the train, or especially if there's a choice involved, get on the bus. Where do I sit? Because every person in this bus is an opportunity for my life to unfold. And you sit down with the expectation that nothing's going to happen, you don't even pay attention, or do you sit down with the expectation that that person across from you could speak something that's going to change your life? So we look for the mountaintops, to go to, or the cave that we're going to meet the great sage to explain everything to us, or what have you. But I wonder if they're not like sitting next to us on the bus. Or maybe it's the bus driver who's just giving us a hard time because we didn't have exact change. But actually there's a teaching that's going on. And I don't know, but there's a German artist who says, the new mystery places are the train stations and the airports. You think where all the noise is, where all the mess is, where everything is confusing, if you just attend, maybe it's paradise. In The Way to Shambhala, a nice little book on how you get to paradise, basically. It said that if you walk through the valley of Shambhala, the place of the magical kingdom, if you will, the paradise, you will just see shacks, peasants doing their business in their rice fields or what have you. Unless you have the eyes to see, in which case the roofs are golden, each being is radiant, and they have fulfilled their lives. And so sometimes I feel like the gap between us is that blindness which arises because of the fear, the overlay that separates us, and I don't engage the world. I don't open up. I don't have sufficient trust and love to be available. So as you were speaking, I kept getting the sense of I do turn away, and then the shack appears where there was a golden roof before.
May I?
Yeah, and then I think we're probably at the close. 5 whole minutes. Okay.
I would love to hear you share from your perspective as the representative of the contemplative world.
Yes, as
In this conversation, in this moment.
Just a minute.
What about these other competencies, that I suggested may be important and perhaps even critical and valuable? At the one level, moving from the presence and awareness skills to, okay, how do we actually understand difference in cultures? And then even the more sort of structural, systemic. What about that sort of knowledge building? And I'm asking that in actually quite a direct way. What is the impediment to that?
Yeah. It's a great question. I think so I'm on the one side a physicist and all this and president of Mind and Life, but a lot of that, especially a lot of these organizations, is around skills. Just think of the 20 people who helped put this on, the skills required to put on this conference with 1,500 people. I could say, hey, we ought to have a conference as president, and nothing will happen. So if we're going to move our intentions into the planet, into the world, into the society in which we live, it requires skillful means. Otto Scharmer has this, as we met with actually at Otto Scharmer's workshop, but Otto Scharmer has this wonderful concept of presencing, that there's a way in which the presence, the future presences in us, and we create what he calls a kind of landing strip for the future. So it kind of, we're open in the way that Simone Weil was describing, and something arises, there's a kind of insight, wisdom, and now we need to bring it into the world. That's hard. It requires all those capacities and skills. And I think there are a couple of things that I've learned where I have a lot of faith in prototyping, or in making in miniature what might be done in large. If you could just take the people in this room, or even the people right here, you know, and in that little community, that little group, affect what it is we intend by way of overcoming the gap, by the way of seeing each other really, by way of partnering really. My guess is the contagion, you know, it would just start to ripple out. You turn to somebody else as you walked out of here with a different gesture, and that person would be drawn into the social field that was created. And then another, and another group. So I feel like the power of just getting it right in miniature becomes a generative force in the universe. You know, it's like planting in fertile soil. In some ways, the life energy is always available, but it's looking for a home. Sometimes it's the individual sitting on their cushion, but frankly, most of the time in organizations and in society, it's 2 and 3 and 4. And if you get that geometry right, then something enters into that where 2 or more are gathered in a particular intention. Something else begins to resonate within that field that then can grow out. So you don't have to take the whole world on right away. That can wait till at least tomorrow afternoon. But I think, you know, if the 2s and the 3s can get it, then we'll manage it. And that's part of the genius, and then we'll end here, I think. The genius of the architecture of this gathering was that 2 was the number, right, that came up in every session. And 2 that didn't just look like, or were alike on the, in some sense on the outside, but were deeply aligned on the inside. So thanks again to the organizers of this session, and we'll have closing remarks from Grace. Thank you.
Thank you, Arthur and Sheryl. It was very thought-provoking and heartfelt. Thank you. I started the day with the word wow. And here we are some 6 hours later, and I think that that is definitely a place to end, is wow. I want to briefly and heartfelt thanks and gratitude once again to the Planning Committee, to Arthur, Zajonc, Sheryl, Petty, John Powell, wherever you are. I also want to really deeply acknowledge the work of the faculty. What I did not mention earlier was that we asked 2 people who had never met each other before to get together in a dialogue last June, and they had several months to meet and talk, most of them remotely, and to create what you saw today. So the dialogue you see with Arthur, Sheryl, John, and myself, the dialogues that you witnessed today are the models of hopefully what we will have going into the future. So thank you so much, faculty. You're all over, so thank you. And a big, big thank you to our operations team, and in particular Liza Katz, who had to leave to go work on the main symposium, but Liza has held the million little pieces of this meeting together and has pulled off what you have seen today. So in absentia, thank you, Liza. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, I want to thank all of you. I had the privilege of sitting in on some sessions, and I ran into many of you in the hallways and in the restaurant. And I am truly touched by your openness, your willing to be creative, you're willing to hold the space, as we talked about this morning. I think truly this is a monumental day, even though it's a first step and a beginning. And I really thank you for deeply participating in this experience. And I hope that someday, in 10 years from now, you'll look back on this day and you'll be able to trace at least one thread from this meeting that you've carried forward, or one connection that you made in this meeting that you will take with you into your life and into your work. Lastly, a little bit of business. This has been a remarkable beginning, and there will be another meeting to follow at the Garrison Institute in December. If you look on their website, there is more information about that. And as Sheryl mentioned, we greatly value your opinion. There is a link to the survey in your program, and also you will receive a follow-up email. These events are only as good as your feedback. So please be honest, be as forthright as you have been today, and if I can impose on you for a little more of your generosity to tell us what you feel about this event, I would be most grateful. Thank you. Safe travels. Many blessings to you. Thank you.